Perfect. So I would like to say welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to see all of you out of the orange smoke, which isn't as orange today as it was yesterday. But I think one of the benefits of our opportunity in this new normal is the fact that we are able to not have to go out in that so much. The downside is that while we're sitting here, that means that there are other people who may be around you, and we may see little children running past in the background. And so we just want to ask you to put yourselves on mute so that we don't hear everything that's happening in your household. So I'm Benisa Berry, and I'm the chair of the Townhall subcommittee for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And it is a pleasure to see so many of you here. We basically started working with the Townhall Committee as an outgrowth of the recent happenings around George Floyd and the resultant protests and the civil and racial unrest that we're currently experiencing. And that's basically where the Townhall Committee grew from. And one of the first things that we wanted to do was respond to some of the input that the committee members were receiving about wanting to have an opportunity for the Bar Association community to come together in a way that allows them to express and talk about what's going on, but also to learn and understand a little bit about what's going on. And thirdly, to really move forward, maybe collectively, with how we as an organization and a member association want to address some of the things that are going on. In order to do that, the committee had a lot of discussion around what would be the best way to start the discussion. And we landed on the fact that there are a lot of levels around where people are, and the fact that people have different backgrounds, different levels of awareness, different ways that we've been socialized into this world. And there needed to be some type of level setting or a foundational from a historical perspective. For example, some people were almost like, this is nothing new. I understand everything that's going on. Others are, well, when we talk about racism and we talk about the outpouring, where is this coming from? As though there was a single incident that somehow created this avalanche of emotion and action and organizing around this. So one of the things that we wanted to do is work with the fact that is work with, creating awareness around some of the disparities and the historical conditioning from way back when to now that are continuing to support our current reality. So for example, when we look at disparities, sometimes people are surprised when they realize that there is such a disparity in the wealth of white families and Black families. So when we look at this wealth gap, we see that white families own nearly 10 times the wealth of Black families. So $17,150 for a Black family versus $171,000 for a white family. And as you're looking at that, people may say, yeah, but there's a lot of levels around education, income, etc., that could lead to differences in that wealth gap. But when you disaggregate the data and you dice it up, it's like no matter how you dice it up, it comes out the same. And I'm actually pushing my next button. There we go. So it comes out the same. So for example, if we looked at educational level and we look at the blue steps on the bottom, that shows the wealth level of a Black household from less than high school education to someone with an advanced degree. And as you can see, the disparities are even greater between white and Black families with the more education that you have. And then the same thing goes when you look at income. Well, surely it must be because there's just a higher percentage perhaps of African Americans who have lower wealth, and that's skewing it. Yet again, when you look at the bottom 20% of the income percentile, well, it shows that both white and Black families are pretty poor at that level. And when you get to the top 10%, again, the disparities are even widening even more. So no matter how you slice and dice it, there are these disparities. And we just chose wealth gaps because that's just one way that you can, and the way that our society really looks at success in this particular, in our arena. So when you ask people about those disparities and what else do we need to do to close that gap, there's another disparity where we have a difference in perceptions where 38% of whites actually think that we have already made, or the country has already made, the changes that are needed to give Blacks the equal rights with whites. And you can compare that with 8% of African Americans. And in fact, 43% of African Americans feel that the country will never be in a position to give Blacks the opportunity to be at an equal level when we look at some of the disparities that we're currently experiencing. So when you kind of dig around, well, what's creating these disparities? Again, there's a difference in perception. When asked, Blacks are about twice as likely as whites to point to discrimination as a reason that Blacks have a harder time getting ahead. So 36% of whites will say discrimination is an issue, where 70% of Blacks say discrimination is an issue. And when you look at individual discrimination versus institutional racism, there is again a disparity. And Blacks and whites collectively think that individual racism plays a bigger part in those disparities so it's based on the prejudice of individuals versus institutional racism, where it's built into the laws and institutions of our country. So when you look at all adults, 23% will say it's based on institutional racism, where 66% will say it's based on the prejudice of individuals. And that's what we want to raise today, is around the awareness that the impact of systemic racism and institutional racism is not really being talked about as much and is not being given as much credit around how to address things or how to understand things. So our objectives in working with this presentation is, first of all, is to focus on understanding racism as systemic institutional power, where racism is, race prejudice plus power as compared to just simply individual discrimination and prejudice. Secondly, we're focused on increasing awareness of the history across 5 sectors, and this is really going to just be a sampling of the sectors because it's embedded throughout all sectors, not just education, health, employment, etc. And it's also a recognition of the history is not easily dismissed when people say, oh, but slavery, that was over like a long time ago. That was such in the past. It's increasing the awareness of the continuing influence of our history based upon the foundation of the country and the cumulative impact that has in growing the racial disparities. Thirdly, we're inviting you to disrupt the perceptions and assumptions about African Americans that we get from how we're socialized, how we're brought up in this country, and how it is reinforced on a day-to-day basis. And we really would invite you to use the lens of Blacks to look at what's happening and perhaps maybe even be open to paradigm shifting. Fourthly, we want you to reflect on what you learned today, because a lot of this history isn't something that we learned in school. It definitely wasn't something I learned in school, and our committee really talked a lot about how come we haven't learned this in school and where, why is it kept so hidden? And of course, there's a reason around that as well. But we want to really highlight the fact that there may be differences around what you were taught or what you learned and what you hear today. And we also want you to reflect upon just the total impact of racial oppression collectively upon our nation. And then finally, again, going back to the birth of the Townhall Committee, it's really around developing awareness and readiness for deeper community discussions that we hopefully can continue to move forward collectively as a group with a shared understanding. So briefly, this is a systemic racism model that really looks at how does that middle triangle, the red triangle in the middle around power and economics, stay in place to maintain the status quo, where no matter how usually African Americans and other people of color are really doing all of the things that, you know, they say this is what you do to get ahead, the status quo just continues to stay in place. And this is really around history, culture, and identity. It's really around the foundation of the history of our country being based on a, you know, identity of white supremacy, where it was ingrained in the culture. And when you look at, you know, the number of years, and it really reflects, you know, if we look at slavery, that reflects, you know, more than 75% of the history of our country. And so history, culture, based upon identity and white supremacy is really surrounding what I call this whole infinity circle, where the left side is the internal, like how this is internal to a person, and then external, how it is reinforced through society. So really working with, when we come up in a society that has identified race as a way to differentiate between folks and say that some are better than others and subjugating others or oppressing others, biases are created. And that can be internalized, where someone then believes they are privileged, and people have been privileged from the very beginning, in the sense that it's not just what you get, but what you are protected from. So if you look at the historical roots, whites were protected from being slaves. White were protected from having their property taken through land grabs. So those protections that were in place. And then internalized racism, where when you hear and you are continually dealing with institutions that are giving these same messages in our culture, there is this internalized racism where Blacks begin to feel that what's out there is also something that we have to deal with internally. And so that then is reinforced at the external level with interpersonal relationships between people, at the institutional level, which we're going to really talk about with, you know, with organizations, and then at the structural level between sectors such as education and, you know, the media, etc., which we're also going to talk about today. So collectively, this is what systemic racism is. It's how these dynamics keep everything together to keep the status quo. And it's at such an embedded level that it's not necessarily conscious around everyone. And it's not that you have to be purposely doing it. So if you look at the characteristics, it's really around recognizing that there's an impoverishment. So if some groups are privileged, it means that others, there's an impoverishment of those other groups. There are vested interests among those who have that privilege. And again, consciously or unconsciously, because one has those benefits, they're not as likely to want to increase awareness or do anything about a system that privileges them. It also creates racist relationships between whites and Blacks because of how it actually creates a, it pulls people apart rather than bringing people together. And then the cost and burdens of racism are often borne by Blacks on a day-to-day basis, again, because of the culture, microaggressions, implicit bias, etc. Are really, Blacks carry that burden. And then the racial power of white elites means when you look at who is in power and who has the power within the country, you look at the heads of corporations, you look at who heads government, there is a difference in what the priorities are. There was a study, for example, that identified the top issues and that whites, Blacks, and other people of color thought were important to address in the country. And if you had, one of the issues was racism. And for African Americans, racism was one of the top 3 on the list, whereas amongst white, it was amongst the bottom 3 on their list. And so those who have power to control the agenda don't put racism on the agenda. And then, of course, the power of racist ideas, assumptions, and worldviews being deeply embedded into the culture. And then the resistance to racism. It's not as though this is a willing system where Blacks, for example, don't have any resistance. There's been resistance to racism since the transatlantic slave trade, when those who were being brought over chose to jump off the slave ship rather than, be maintained in captivity until the protests that you see today. So with those protests, there always comes backlash to, again, keep that center triangle in place. So here to talk about these issues and illustrate it across these sectors, we have some panel members that I'd like to introduce you to. Heidi's going to be talking about the history of housing for Black Americans, Heidi Taylor. And then Patanisha Davis-Jenkins will be sharing her thoughts around education. Julianne Giammona will be talking about employment discrimination. Michael Pierson is going to share perspectives around media and entertainment. And that question mark is just, I forgot to take that off. It's not like there's a question about whether or not he's going to do that. He will. And then Qiana Washington will be sharing her views on health. So we're going to have some very brief presentations where we're going to just talk a little bit. And then we are going to save some time at the end to have a question and answer and some discussion. And so Judge Judy Johnson will be leading us in that discussion. And then I will come back at the end around how we are, wanting to think about continuing the conversation within the Bar Association. So before we move to that, and especially as we're working with that Q&A and discussion or anything that you might put in the chat, etc., we want to ask that you honor some community agreements that really support courageous conversations about race. One is to stay engaged. Second, staying engaged may be uncomfortable, and that's also when it means that your body and your thoughts are telling you something that may be something that you can pay attention to. It's an opportunity for your greatest learning. Speak your truth from your own experience. And then, of course, expect and accept non-closure. We're not going to solve anything today. We're really just sharing information. And so as we go through the presentations, we also want you to just keep in mind, one thing about terminology is that there's not necessarily agreement around whether or not the term should be Blacks or African Americans. So we're going to be using that interchangeably, but the focus is really around the descendants of slaves. That's who we're talking about. Thirdly, history is not comprehensive. We're really just throwing out snippets that illustrate some of those dynamics around systemic racism and how that has played out from the time of the beginning of our country until today. And we want people to really recognize the perspective that we're coming from. We're really learning together. And then finally, our time together is ambitious, and I am going to be brutal in keeping people on time So what we will be doing is asking people to go through, and then in the Q&A, there may be additional time to bring out a little bit further some of the thoughts that we weren't able to get through. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Heidi. And again, Heidi's going to talk about housing, and housing really has been considered to be the foundation around racism in the country. A lot because it talks about place and where do Blacks belong and where do they not belong. And especially in where homes and housing is something that is, that's your castle. So Heidi.
Thank you so much, Benisa. I just really want to thank everyone for being here today. And Benisa, if you could stop your sharing, that would be great so I can share mine. Like Benisa said, we're going to be talking about the history of housing for Black Americans. And housing is the foundation of the American dream. Homeownership is how we build security and stability for our families, and so much more. Where we live determines our access to healthcare and opportunities for employment and the quality of our children's education. Whether or not we own a home and the neighborhood where our home is located plays a definitive role in our ability to build wealth as real estate values rise. In America, homeownership is a road to our social and economic success, but that road has been closed to many Black Americans since 1619, when slaves were first brought to this country. For nearly 250 years, slaves owned nothing, not even their clothes. Slaves lived in dilapidated cabins on the farms and plantations where they worked in the fields or in the owner's house. For those who were not provided housing, they were given building materials, which they then used to build their own form of a home. There were often more than 10 people in one home. They slept on straw beds and never complained for fear of punishment. On December 6th of 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, ending legal slavery in the United States. And this technically gave Black Americans the right to home ownership. However, the physical and psychological damages wrought by slavery, along with the failures of Reconstruction, made that nearly impossible. Unable to own property and without access to quality jobs, many former slaves were forced into sharecropping. Sharecropping is a system where the landlord allows a tenant to use the land in exchange for a share of the crop, an arrangement that offered Black farmers no opportunity to begin building wealth. In fact, high interest rates, unpredictable harvests, and shady landlords often left tenant farm families laden with debt that increased year after year. Local laws prevented sharecroppers from moving on to better opportunities as long as they were indebted to their landlord. The most promising hope of independence was General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order number 15, issued on January 16th of 1865. It's most often referred to as 40 acres and a mule. 20 Black ministers lobbied Sherman. They demanded land and they got it. 40,000 freed men settled on 400,000 acres of Sherman land for a little more than 6 months. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor and a sympathizer with the South, overturned the order and returned the land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coast to those who had originally owned it. At that point, the only hope that remained was to move north and start again. There were two waves of the Great Migration, once after World War I and then again during the Great Depression. The promise of factory jobs and wages, education, and improved racial relations gave hope for a Black middle class. In 1920s Tulsa, Black Americans built Black Wall Street, only to have it burned by an angry white mob after a white teenage girl claimed she was raped by a Black man. The same thing happened in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. In the big cities, Black Americans struggled to get ahead. They were disproportionately affected by unemployment. They were the first fired and the last hired. In a desperate attempt to lift people out of poverty, Roosevelt created the Federal Housing Authority, or the FHA. The federal government subsidized low-cost loans, opening up homeownership to millions of average Americans for the first time. The GI Bill allowed soldiers returning from the war to get low-interest mortgages. While it seemed as though the new programs would give everyone a new start, Black Americans were excluded from those loans. The FHA allowed lenders to use racial covenants and thereby openly banned Blacks from obtaining a loan to buy a house. Hence the reason why scholars say that such programs were the beginning of state-sponsored segregation. Racial covenants kept Black families in the cities and out of the suburbs. They barred homeowners from selling or leasing their homes to non-whites. Racial covenants were common in many neighborhoods across the U.S., including Rockridge in Oakland, which was developed in 1920, and Gregory Gardens in Pleasant Hill in the late 40s and 50s. In fact, you should check your own deeds. You might be surprised at what you find. As racial covenants were being used to keep Blacks out of the suburbs, Roosevelt's FHA programs resulted in propaganda campaigns that lured white people to the suburbs. William J. Levitt built 7 such neighborhoods across the U.S. with FHA loans. Standard Levitt townhouses included a white picket fence, green lawns, and modern appliances. Another builder, like Levitt, Henry Dolger, built the West Coast version of Levitt towns. You can find those housing tracts in the Sunset District of San Francisco and the Westlake District in Daly City. The new suburban homes were dubbed little boxes because they were built fast and cheap. One house could be built in one day on the assembly line. They all looked the same, and so did the homeowners. Blacks were excluded from obtaining mortgages to these homes. Levitt was explicit. He was not going to rent to blacks. He was not going to sell to blacks. Still, he used public money, white and black people's money, to build 7 Levittown neighborhoods. Here's a clip from a resident in Levittown, Pennsylvania.
I live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here. One of the main reasons was because it was a white community. And that's the only place I intend to live. If I have to leave Levittown, I will do so.
Not everyone thought like that lady, though. Irene Corrigan tried to sell her house to a black couple in Washington, D.C., and in so doing broke the private agreement made by 30 white homeowners that none of them would sell, rent, or allow blacks to obtain their land by any means. The Supreme Court, however, sided with the homeowners, stopping the sale and forcing the young black couple to find their housing elsewhere. Meanwhile, back in the cities, blacks faced ongoing efforts to segregate their communities. In Detroit, the FHA would not loan money to a developer unless he built a wall 6 feet high and 8 miles long to separate the new white development from an abutting black neighborhood. On an appraisal, the black neighborhood showed up as red. This practice of redlining was used by appraisers to rate neighborhoods and ultimately refused to finance mortgages in those areas. Of the $120 billion worth of new housing subsidized by the government between 1934 and 1962, less than 2% went to non-white families. Blacks were locked out of the home ownership just as most white Americans were finally getting in. In 1948, the Supreme Court finally ruled that racial covenants were unconstitutional. And while you might think that's the end of it, private developers like Levitt could still refuse to sell homes to non-whites, and real estate agents steered non-white prospective home buyers away from white neighborhoods. In fact, Levitt evicted some white people who wanted to attract and open up housing to people of color. Following government guidelines, lenders continued to base property appraisals on race, denying loans to communities with non-whites or insisting on higher fees and interest rates to cover their, quote, risk. By systematically devaluing non-white neighborhoods and home buyers, federal intervention helped disguise racial discrimination and enabled many to claim that the resulting segregation was, quote, market-driven. Urban housing projects originally built for white people during the Depression were mostly vacant in the 40s and 50s. Blacks were allowed to fill those vacancies, but as whites left the cities, so did the jobs. Black Americans were stuck in public housing, struggling to pay the rent. These vertical slums, as they were called, deteriorated. The neighborhoods devolved in every way as the entire infrastructure was left financially unsupported. In yet another attempt to make things right, the Johnson administration passed the 1968 Fair Housing Act. But the same tactics used before continued. Appraisers continued to factor race into their assessments, and some practices, such as racial steering and predatory lending, continue to this day. Benisa, I have 8 minutes on mine, I'm sorry. So I still have 7 or so left. Such as racial steering and predatory lending, they continue to this day. It wasn't until 1988 that fair housing laws were amended to expand their scope and include important enforcement provision. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, housing prices rose dramatically, and white homeowners who benefited from discriminatory federal policies were able to sell their homes at great profit. Meanwhile, Black Americans who had been denied federal assistance had homes worth far less or faced an even higher cost of entry into the housing market. A home in and around Daly City in 1949 cost $10,000. It doubled and was $20,000 in 1966. And today, that home is worth $720,000. So where did the white people go with all of that new wealth? Back to the city, of course. Look at Hunters Point in San Francisco and West Oakland. Some older residents don't even recognize their neighborhoods anymore. The rents are so high that folks can't afford to live there any longer, which means moving to an entirely new area, finding new doctors, finding a new church, saying goodbye to old friends. 66% of the Bay Area's low-income Black households are either experiencing gentrification or facing the risk of gentrification. Community leaders call this resegregation. We've talked about decades of Black Americans being excluded from the housing market, and that yearning for wealth and roots, a place to call home, is just what predatory lenders focused on in the 2008 mortgage crisis. That's why Black Americans were affected in disproportionate numbers. The green dotted line here shows how equity for Blacks would have increased had there been no recession, closing the gap ever so quickly. But that didn't happen, as Kimberly Jones explains.
If I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. Now, at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood. How can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So
Black Americans have been and still are locked out of the lucrative housing market, depriving them of the opportunity to build wealth. Depriving them of the opportunity to build the home equity that could fund a comfortable retirement or help put their kids through college. The pervasive forces of segregation have and still do trap Black families in poor neighborhoods with inferior schools, inadequate health care, limited employment opportunities, and aggressive hostile policing. A moment ago, you heard Kimberly Jones say that Blacks in America can't win because the game is fixed. For many Black Americans looking to find their piece of the American dream, the housing game is an oppressive, vicious cycle that spans generations. Slavery wasn't that long ago, and as Benisa said, it's 75% of our history. It has robbed Black Americans of their healthy, secure, prosperous, and fulfilling lives that we all deserve. The hope of this history lesson on housing is to spark a conversation about our future and what we want. Without low-income housing in predominantly white suburbs, Black Americans are forced further out from the city centers to be able to afford housing. In 2015, President Obama enacted the AFFH, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. It requires cities to keep stats on low-income housing to receive funding from the Housing and Urban Development Department. Trump terminated the program. We need to bring it back. Who qualifies for public housing in those nice neighborhoods? Well, since 1996 in California, the government has not been allowed to consider race in deciding who gets public housing. Prop 16 will change that. It's on the November ballot. And finally, let's talk about reparations. As Kimberly Jones explained, when Black Americans pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and built business and communities, they have been burned, like Tulsa and Rosewood in the early 20s. This beautiful young lady, Leslie Benningfield, or Mother Randall, was a little girl when 300 Black businesses were burned to the ground and 300 Black people were killed that night. Mother Randall is 105 years old, or young, and she hasn't stopped working for a better tomorrow. Just last week, she, as a survivor of Tulsa, filed a lawsuit for reparations. We should follow that case. Finally, I just want to thank you all again for being here. We have come to the end of my presentation, and I hope that it informs your journey for justice. I will leave a few resource links in the chat if anyone is interested. And as I've said, housing is just one of the foundations of wealth in this country, as are the other topics that will be discussed here tonight. And the next important pillar is education. And here to talk about that is Patanisha Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patanisha Davis, and I'm so proud to have you all here. I'm an attorney with Key Counsel PC, and my section is The Black Struggle for Equal Education, a Historical Narrative. I'm going to start my slideshow up for you. There we go. During this section, it's our goal, that objective is to talk about the disparities in educations by Black based on the institution of racism, and education during slavery, education during post-slavery, the GI Bill, separate but equal, the Civil Rights Act, and education, and the current state of education, and how we all can help. In 1852, Frederick Douglass, who was a social reformer, an abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman, stated, "Education means emancipation. It means light and liberty. It means the uplifting of the soul of man into a glorious light of truth, the light only by which man can be free. To deny education to any people is one of the greatest crimes against human nature." I want to point out that Frederick Douglass didn't say person. He said to deny to people, meaning to deny to a race of people, is a crime against humanity. So let's talk about education during slavery. In 1739, the Stonewall Rebellion occurred. Because of the rebellion, slave owners brought about the enactment of laws forbidding the education of Black people. In 1740 in South Carolina, we saw some of the first and the earliest laws forbidding the education of slaves. As of 1833, states like Alabama had enacted laws that punished slaves by whipping and lynching, cutting off an arm if you touched a book. And to the educator, they were, if not beaten or penalized physically, were penalized financially, with penalties of $250 to $600 for any person who assisted in slave literacy. That's approximately $7,000 to $6,000 today. Due to the laws around education of Blacks, by 1860, it was estimated that only 5% of Black people, of the Black population, could read. After the Revolutionary War, Quakers really played an important role in promotion of education of Black people. However, the right to literacy didn't guarantee an actual education, and this was due to the lack of resources, the financial hardships, and the failed support of Blacks by whites. Black people began to psychologically develop a system of acceptance of exclusion or figure out alternative ways to become educated. So let's look at then and look at now. Then, meaning during slavery, Blacks were completely refused the right to education. Elias Caldwell, who was a famous attorney at the time, stated, "The more you improve the condition of these people, the more you cultivate their minds, the more miserable you make them in their present state. You give them a higher relish for those privileges which they can never attain. In turn, will we intend for a blessing slavery into a curse? No, if they must remain in their present situation, keep them in the lowest state of degradation and ignorance. The nearer you bring them to the conditions of brutes, the better chance do you give them of possessing," excuse me, sorry, going the wrong way, "their apathy." Let's look at today. Today, Black students represent 19% of students with disabilities, and a ridiculous 30% of those with disability are restrained or kept back at school. When Black students and white students commit similar infractions, Black students are suspended and expelled 3 times more than a white student is. Black students, who make up 16% of enrollment in education, but they represent 27% of students referred to law enforcement and 31% of students subject to arrest. We are looking at a school to prison pipeline, and still, in a different way, it's a refusal of education. It may look different, but it ends in the same result. So not only were adults stopping Blacks, but there was the perception that were given to white students, and I apologize in advance for the words that are in this, but this was a book that was a nursery rhyme to little white children. 10 little nigger boys went out to dine, 1 choked himself, and then there were 9. 9 little nigger boys sat up very late, 1 overslept himself, and then there were 8. 8 little nigger boys traveling in Devon, 1 said he stayed there, and then there were 7. 7 little nigger boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in half, and then there were 6. 6 little nigger boys playing with a hive. A bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5. 5 little nigger boys going in law. One got in the chancery, then there were 4. 4 little nigger boys going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3. 3 little nigger boys walking in the zoo. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2. 2 little nigger boys sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up, and then there was 1. 1 little nigger boy fell all alone. He went out and hanged himself, and then there was none. This book, I'll tell you, was in the 1800s, but as we can see, it's in color. It was consistently reproduced and presented to children, white children. Let's talk about the shaping of perception of Blacks. Next, education post-slavery. Before the end of the Civil War, the education of Black slaves in the United States was a criminal endeavor. Although efforts were made in the newly formed free Black communities to organize schools, few Blacks received any education at all before the Reconstruction era, when public schools were opened. Even then, establishments of Black children were poorly financed and largely ignored. Emerging in 1870 were the Jim Crow laws that ruled educational systems and schools became racially segregated. In 1890, the first colored school was built in Winter Park, and Black children had the harshest of all conditions. In 1896, all of us who lawyers here know the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. It established the separate public schools for Blacks and whites, the doctrine of separate but equal. The decision also deprived Black children of equivalent educational opportunities. Colored schools had to make do with horrible financial support and negligent resources. And due to the size of classes, teachers couldn't give personalized attention to students. This began what we call the Black tax, which is the Black people have to work 10 times harder than their white counterparts to achieve like or lower than like outcomes. Separate but equal. Let's look at the school here. The school on your left, a school for white children in 1930. School on your right, only miles away from the other school for Blacks. Now, let's look at then and now. Jim Crow provided lack of resources, a lack of funding. Colored schools had to make do with horrible finances and negligent resources. And there were far too many kids in school, children in the classroom. Let's look at today. Today, by their demographics, most schools, public and private, are deeply segregated by race and social economic status. I went to Oakland Public Schools, and I can't remember ever seeing a white face in elementary school, maybe until maybe the 3rd or 4th grade. There are a lack of resources, textbooks, technology, and staffing. A lot of the schools that are in predominantly Black or brown neighborhoods have lower API scores and a lack of funding. The buildings in predominantly Black and brown locations are dilapidated versus new facilities. So let's look at my hometown of Oakland, California. In this photo, you'll see that the green bubbles are schools that are in predominantly white neighborhoods. The green bubbles, these schools are some of the higher ranking, even some of them have they're blue ribbon schools in the state of California. The lighter olive color bubbles will be neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and brown. They represent below 50% of, they're the low achieving schools, getting a score out of 10 of 4 to 5. Looking at Oakland schools, 2 schools who are within a few miles of each other, Carl B. Monk has a population of 5% white, 62% Black, 20% Hispanic, and 4% Asian, is in the bottom 50%, versus Chabot, which is 57% white, 10% Hispanic, 8% Asian, 8% Black, and 17% 2 races, is in the top 5%. And this is a trend that we see all throughout different cities. And it goes back to what Heidi talked about zoning, school zoning, and where people can go to school. But let's talk about the GI Bill. Now, lawmakers drafted the GI Bill in 1944 to provide funding to veterans returning from World War II. But it was never the intention of the lawmakers that Black veterans would receive the benefits of the GI Bill. In fact, Mississippi Congressman John Rankin, who was a known racist and a defender of segregation, fought to ensure that Black veterans would not get the GI Bill. He also fought to quarantine and keep enslaved, as well as deport anyone who was of Japanese descent. From the start, Black veterans had trouble securing the GI Bill benefits, and this was that some could not access the benefit because they had not been given an honorable discharge. And a much larger number of Black veterans were discharged dishonorably than their white counterparts. Veterans who didn't qualify could not find facilities. The veterans who did qualify for the GI Bill could not find facilities that could deliver on the bill's promises. For example, Black veterans who wanted to be involved in vocational training programs, such as plumbing, electricity, and the printing business, couldn't do it because their white-only facilities didn't have the mechanisms and the technology available to them. As Heidi stated, these same Black veterans were not afforded the opportunity, nor did they have the income to flow into the newly created suburbs. However, in 1954, because of Brown versus the Board of Education, we saw a small movement in the right direction. It was the landmark case that reversed Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus the Board of Education. The ruling was unanimous, and Chief Justice Earl Warren famously declared, "Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." While this was a huge accomplishment for Blacks in their attempt to obtain equal education, Southern states still refused to integrate. After the Little Rock Nine that you'll see to the left went to Little Rock High School, the school preferred to close than to integrate. Even schools like Ole Miss, and many other colleges refused admittance to Blacks deep into the late 60s until the passage of the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act. In July 2nd, 1964, President LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act. Data released by the U.S. Department of Education shows that the Civil Rights Act helped with racial disparities in education, but it still shows significant issues that the act has yet to face. These issues are educational discrepancies that still exist for African American students, the fact that Black female students are 6 more times likely to receive an out-of-school suspension than any other group of girls. Coursework in predominantly Black schools is not as rigorous as schools that are predominantly white. Black schools have lack of diversity, meaning they're predominantly all Black. There are opportunity gaps created in achievement due to systemic and institutional inequities. And Black students are less qualified, have lower paid teachers. And a lot of teachers have lower expectations for their students. Black children are less likely than white children to have access to the necessary courses to prepare them for college. So affirmative action, before we get into this, let's talk about affirmative action. Although the Civil Rights Act was established, many institutions violated the new law. There came a need to create something that would even the playing field. This was affirmative action. The Johnson administration embraced affirmative action in 1965, thank you, Benisa, by issuing Executive Orders 11246 and 11375. The original order mandated that federal contractors cannot discriminate against employees on the basis of race, religion, and national origin. However, in 1996, California voters eliminated affirmative action with Proposition 209. Due to the adverse effects of Prop 209 on people of color and women, voters will have the opportunity this November to overturn it with Prop 16. So how can you help? The institution number 1 must be broken. First, to break it, we must recognize the disparity. If you can't see the problem, you can't fix the problem. Second, support by joining local boards and committees, by working with cross agencies on their policy and collaborative practices. It is so imperative that we fix the many arms of the system in education, housing, employment, media, the criminal justice system, and the medical field to see a positive shift to equity. We need to continue our diversity initiatives, and we need to eradicate school and residential zoning. Demand the education of Black history at all schools. At my son's school here in Brentwood, there are literally only a handful of Black children in his elementary school. When I went to the school during Black History Month, I asked, where is Black history? The librarian said, we have 1 Black book, and she said it with pride. Lastly, please support Prop 16, and if you see something, say something. Thank you so much.
Thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and know it's a long program, but I think it's a lot of information that we're trying to cram in here, and we're doing our best right now just to get you a lot of information, because all of us have to scale our materials down quite a bit. So I'm covering today Blacks in media and entertainment. And I will be using the terms African Americans and Blacks interchangeably. As discussed before, some people don't agree with that terminology, but I'm going to be using them interchangeably. So I have a few questions. Have you ever considered where your perceptions of African Americans came from, or where you shaped your opinions and beliefs about African Americans? Did your perceptions come from your parents? Did it come from your family? Friends you grew up with? Friends from school? Co-workers? Maybe from your current friends and colleagues? How much of your perceptions actually came from your own personal experiences and direct exposure to African Americans? Ask yourself a question. In an intimate and personal setting, how much direct personal exposure have you really had with African Americans? Have you ever thought about how much your opinions and beliefs of African Americans are shaped by the images that you've seen in the media and entertainment? Malcolm X said, "The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's power, because they control the minds of the masses." In one form or another, media influences the majority of the population in the United States. With the advancements of technology, the advent of social media, the impacts on mass media are profound. Most people utilize some form of media in their daily lives every single day. Media impacts our beliefs, assumptions, public ideology, as well as our experiences. In fact, the average American spends 11 hours per day listening, watching, reading, or being exposed to some form of media. I did a lot of research on the studies that were done. There's extensive research that's been done on the media, impact of media, and exposure to media, and that's a presentation within itself. But just a couple of the key things that they found. They found that the media images have the greatest impact on perceptions when viewers have less real-world experience on the topic. In other words, there's a media world can be mistaken for the real world unless you have sufficient personal experience to counteract those effects. Also, there has been research and studies that show that the more individual interacted with other people who have different cultural backgrounds, the more likely these individuals could see the positive traits and characteristics of other people. Because television, the more you consume television, the more you adopt those traits. And there's tons and tons of research on that. So one thing that the research found, and one thing that's been discussed and debated, is the distorted patterns and portrayals of Blacks in the media. There's a robust body of documents and research that covers Blacks in the media, how it's been distorted relative to the real world. And while individual studies tend to focus on a single genre or medium, such as TV, fiction, magazines, advertisement, video games, the research have all kind of showed these broad patterns. There's 5 broad patterns they show. They show that African Americans are underrepresented, they're negatively portrayed, there's positive association. I'll talk about that briefly. There's positive association, there's the problem frame, and there's missing stories. And the negative associations are the ones in particular that I'm going to focus on, but just to touch the other ones. So underrepresentation, for instance, in video games, there's an absence of Black characters, of Black lead characters. They're always the backup support characters. When there's talking head expert commentary on the news, there's very, very few African Americans who offer commentary. That's changed recently with all the race things going on, but typically there's no coverage. Computer users and TV commercials, users of luxury items and print ads, or even relatable characters like positive black fathers in media. You never see those. The negative associations are exaggerated. You see criminality, unemployment, poverty. The idle black man on the street corner is not the true face of poverty in America, but it's the dominant one portrayed in media. The positive associations, you see those in sports, you see those in entertainers, musicality, while there are people with, that falls within this limited positive images. It's just a small portion. It's typically confined to just sports and entertainment. The problem frame. Blacks are often portrayed as the problem. Poverty. When you see a story on violence, unemployment, when you see looting and rioting and civil unrest, it's associated with African Americans now. Then you have the missing stories. Positive stories of Black people are largely just ignored by the media. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to address just the negative associations in the media. So going way back, the earliest images of Blacks in the media, Blacks were always portrayed as savages, violent, animals, and as mere property to be used and disposed of as the owners pleased. And if you notice the images, almost all the early images, they distort the physical features and appearances of African Americans. They look almost non-human, almost animal-like. In a lot of cases, they do look animal-like. The skin's typically presented black instead of a shade of brown. The lips and facial features are often exaggerated. The portrayal of Blacks as apes was an early and common popular depiction in the media. Blacks have often been directly associated and connected to apes and monkeys. And this is despite actual scientific evidence that race does not have roots in science or biology. We are 99.99% the same genetically. The view of Blacks as an ape narrative, that was real prevalent back in 1906. In 1906, it was so prevalent in 1906 that they actually had a Black man as an exhibit in the monkey house at the Bronx Zoo. His name was Oda Benga. He was a Congo pygmy, and he was featured in a zoo exhibit at the Bronx Zoo. And he was a real popular exhibit. He was kept against his will, like a circus animal. And it wasn't until African-American newspapers started to put pressure on the mayor that the mayor actually decided to order his release. And just kind of a note, once he got released, he attempted for a few years to get back to Africa, never made it back to Africa, and eventually committed suicide. He just couldn't deal with being free. The Black man as a monkey or ape narrative continued to this day. These are actual images that was taken, they were either taken directly from newspaper articles or from mainstream media social outlets. It displays the Obamas as monkeys and apes. From 1915 to 1971, the first films in Hollywood was made in 1910, and the first images of Blacks appeared on the big screen shortly thereafter. The 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, originally called The Klansman, was produced and directed by D.W. Griffin. Birth of the Nation was about the Civil War, the assassination of President Lincoln, and the birth of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was also covered Reconstruction period. Up until the 1960s, Birth of a Nation was considered the greatest American film ever made. According to film critic Roger Ebert, Birth is still praised as influential, groundbreaking, and historically important. In 1992, the Library of Congress deemed the film culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant, and selected it for preservation in National Film Registry. This was actually the first film that was actually presented and screened in the White House, President Woodrow Wilson. It's like writing history with lightning. And my only regret is that this is so terribly true. This was a quote attributed to President Wilson. Although he later denied it, it still appears on the front of the film today, on all the prints, it's on the prints. A little bit about the film, and the film is really important because it was the first film to depict Blacks in popular cinema. And a lot of the stereotypes that we have today were started with this film and have continued on beyond this film. Back then, Black characters were played by white actors in blackface, and they were portrayed as unintelligent, sexually aggressive towards white women. The KKK was presented as a historic force necessary to preserve American values and white supremacist social orders. So how were Blacks portrayed in his films? Blacks were observed stuffing ballot boxes while whites were being denied their rights to vote because Blacks were voting. And although history proves this was not the case because Blacks were disenfranchised from voting during that time, it showed newly elected members of the South Carolina legislature displaying extremely racist stereotypical behavior. These members were taking off their shoes, kicking up their feet on the desk, and drinking liquor and feasting on fried chicken. The Blacks and fried chicken narrative was created with this film and continues today. It also shows a Black man who attempts to rape a white woman. The Black man wanting to rape a white woman narrative was also created. And also there was fears, it renewed the fears because it displayed the Congress passing a mixed race marriages, allowing races to mix. And also another thing that was significant about this film is that the depiction of a Black woman, this was the first depiction of the Black Jezebel in American cinema. She was portrayed as overly sexual, and she uses her feminine wiles to deceive and corrupt the formerly good white man. These are the stereotypes that we have, that was created with this film that still exists today. Blacks are seen as unintelligent, sexually aggressive, dishonest, thieves, untrustworthy, disrespectful, again, fried chicken eating, overusers of alcohol, violent, aggressive, lazy, and interlopers. Black women were seen as Jezebels, women as overly sexualized, and women as untrustworthy and dishonest. Now, although that narrative about Black women being sexualized in his first film, it kind of went away for a period of time because Black women became mammies and nannies and other depictions of Black women. So from 1915 to the 1970s, Blacks were portrayed as mammies, toms, the tragic mulattoes, pickaninnies. For decades, Blacks were portrayed by white actors in blackface. In the early years of theater and film, Al Jolson was widely considered the greatest entertainer alive, and he was known as the king of blackface. That was back in the turn of the century in 1900s. Fast forward to 2008. One of the world's most renowned actors and well-loved celebrities played blackface in 2008's Tropic Thunder, Robert Downey Jr. C. Thomas Howell, Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, Ted Danson, they've all done blackface. There is a whole list of celebrities. There's at least 100 popular celebrities and even current celebrities who have engaged in blackface displaying in public. The image of the pickaninny. This is a 2019 Prada ad. This to the right. This is a product that Prada put out the mass, and it goes back to the pickaninny. This is also Gucci. They got in on the act. This is from a fashion show earlier this year. John McEnroe was basically threw tantrums, was a crybaby, but when he showed up, people understood that's just how he is. He's very passionate. But Serena Williams is presented almost as an ape or not a human. So from the 70s, there was the black exploitation films, and it was interesting because they were marketed as, these are the films that empower black people. It shows black people, they're created and they're an element, and great sense of pride for black people, black power, black people are putting it to the man. But what people didn't know, that these films were produced, written, and directed by predominantly all white men.
Michael, that's your time.
Okay.
So can we transition?
Yes.
And, okay.
So,
and I think we're going to go back to Julianne, so to employment. Your transition, Michael.
So we have Julianne Giammona. She has her presentation ready to go on employment.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry for that delay. Teresa has control of the slides now, so I think we will be fine. Thanks, Teresa. I want to start off this discussion with a statement that for some like me may be new information to internalize, and that statement is there on the slide that we're all looking at, but I think it's worth speaking it out loud. The historical roots of employment discrimination against Black persons still create inequity and prejudice that permeate today's labor market for Black Americans. So when I first saw that statement that I just read, I found myself asking, how can it be a true statement? California enacted the Fair Employment and Housing Act in 1959, 61 years ago, that prohibited discrimination in employment based upon race. The Federal Civil Rights Act was passed in 1965, 55 years ago. Title VII of that act prohibits all states from engaging in race discrimination in employment. How then can it be true that systemic racism still exists in the hiring and retention of employment for Black persons when it's illegal? Until the murder of George Floyd, I am embarrassed to say that I did not know the historical underpinnings of slavery that impact today's labor force. For example, I did not know that in 1935, when the Social Security Act was passed, the coverage did not include farm, agricultural, or domestic workers. A disproportionate number of Black people worked in these occupational groups at that time, and most historians agree that this original exclusion under the Social Security Act is yet another example of intentional systemic racism against Black people. Next slide, please, Teresa.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what's going on, why it's not letting me advance the slides. Is that the one you wanted?
So right after, yes, we got it, thank you. Right after the Civil War, the Black codes were passed in most of the southern states that denied Black people the right to testify against white people, to serve on juries or in the state militia, to vote, most importantly, to start a new job without approval of their prior employer. The defining feature of the Black codes was restricting freedom of movement and compelling Black people to work for low wages or no wages at all. A broad vagrancy law authorized the arrest of recently freed slaves for basically just hanging out. Black people were not allowed to sit on a street corner, sipping a cold drink, or just visiting. If you were Black and unemployed, you would be arrested under the vagrancy law and forced into involuntary labor, which really was no different than slavery. Convict leasing became quite popular. A Black man would be arrested, then leased to a plantation owner like he was a piece of property or chattel, and forced into free labor. So when the slaves were finally freed, the Black codes were enacted as yet another way for white America to keep benefiting from free labor. I was shocked to learn that many of these vagrancy laws remained in effect until the Supreme Court finally outlawed the last one in 1972. Another example of white people's attempt to remove economic choice and power from Black people was seen in the 1921 Tulsa massacre that Heidi talked about in her slideshow, and I think Patanisha touched on. The Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma had been able to defy all odds and actually thrive as the epicenter of African-American business and culture in the early 1900s. This district was referred to as Black Wall Street. Its population was close to 10,000 people, all wealthy Black people who owned their own businesses. It was a district built for Black people by Black people. It was completely self-contained, self-reliant. They had their own luxury shops, restaurants, doctor's offices, school system, post office, banks, etc. The point is, it was self-contained. No one needed any white people, and that was a problem for the local residents. Enter the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, ostensibly about a Black teenager accused of attempting to sexually assault a white female teenager, but really in essence was a targeted effort to remove the economic power and choice that Black people had finally been able to establish in this Greenwood district by decimating that entire district. Over 300 businesses, hundreds of lives, and all the homes. Next slide, please. Yay, it worked that time. Thanks, Teresa. So historically, I want to skip now and talk about the labor market for Black women. Historically, since the end of slavery, Black women have always been required to work. In 1880, approximately 35% of married Black women and 73% of single Black women were in the labor force. In contrast, only approximately 7% of married white women and 24% of single white women were in the labor force. During the late 1800s and into the 20th century, Black women were primarily employed in the low-wage agricultural and domestic service jobs. The need for domestic service jobs increased in the 1970s when white women began to enter the workforce in mass numbers. The top 5 occupations held by Black women as of April 2020 that are listed on this slide are of particular significance because most of these jobs do not traditionally offer benefits such as vacation, sick leave, retirement, health benefits. Among full-time year-round workers, for every dollar earned by white men, Black women earn 62 cents, while white women earn 79 cents. This discrepancy in pay is particularly offensive when viewed in light of the fact that oftentimes Black families are more reliant on women's income, because a lot of times women, 70% of Black mothers are breadwinners for their families. This is not because, as some would argue, that Black men are lazy and irresponsible or because they're violent criminals, but rather because Black men have historically experienced a precarious position in the labor market, largely due to laws passed with the intent of criminalizing what would otherwise be considered legal activity. In addition to the pay discrepancies, many Black women don't have the wealth and savings that a white woman has for necessary emergencies. A 2020 study showed that the combined median assets, such as cash, retirement funds, investments, real estate, for a single Black woman, $200, compared to a white woman, $15,600. And when you compare that to a single white man, $28,900. Next slide, please. Although workplace discrimination is against the law, the overwhelming data continues to show that bias and prejudice are huge problems when it comes to a Black person trying to get a job and keep a job. Everything I'm going to reference, the statistics, excuse me, is prior to COVID. That is, I'm not going to discuss the disparate impact that COVID has obviously had on the Black population, which is clearly a negative impact. A 2019 study shows that 85% of race discrimination claims filed with the EEOC fail. Additionally, the budget provided to the EEOC today, adjusted for inflation, is less than what it was receiving in 1980. The EEOC employs 42% less staff, yet the country's labor force increased by 50% since 1980. Lastly, even though Black workers comprise 13% of the workforce, racial discrimination against Black persons counts for 26% of all the claims filed with the EEOC. This disproportionate number speaks to the often covert discrimination Black people face when attempting to obtain a job. One recent study found that whitening a resume increases a person's chance of obtaining a job. We can go to the next slide. So this is an example of, this is a study. In this particular study, 1,600 resumes were sent out to entry-level jobs posted on job search websites in 16 metropolitan areas in the United States. Some of the resumes included information that clearly pointed out the applicant's minority status, while others were whitened or scrubbed of racial clues, like changing Lakeisha to Lorraine and Jamal to Jared. 25% of Black candidates received callbacks from their whitened resumes, while only 10% got calls when they left ethnic details intact, even though the qualifications were completely identical. This study underscores the need for ongoing diversity training in the workplace, focusing on implicit bias. Unfortunately, recently, President Trump directed the White House of Management and Budget to issue a memo preventing federal agencies from providing any training that involves a discussion of, quote, white privilege or, quote, critical race theory. The memo states, and I do quote directly from the memo, "The president has directed me to ensure that federal agencies cease and desist from using taxpayer dollars to fund these divisive, un-American propaganda training sessions." We can go to the next slide, Teresa. This is just a brief look. It's no secret that Black workers regularly face higher unemployment rates with less stable jobs that offer benefits than white workers, and that's what this slide is showing. The next slide, I have a graph. For over a decade prior to COVID, of course, the unemployment rate, as shown here, was at a 50-year low. It had fallen to a 50-year low. So we were all pretty much thrilled with that. Except, next slide, please. Even so, there remained a significant difference in the unemployment rate for Black workers versus white workers. This graph is showing 5.5% for Black workers, 2.8% for white workers. The time period was right before COVID, November 2018, October 2019. Next slide. And it doesn't matter if you're Black and educated with a college degree, the unemployment rate still remains high. This shows from November 2018 to 2019, the Black unemployment rate was 40% higher than white college graduates in the same period. Black workers, no matter what their education, still face impediments in the labor market: employment discrimination, occupational segregation, and unequal pay. Next slide, please, Teresa. So this graph shows that Black workers earn significantly less than white workers. Lower wages for Black workers translates into lower savings as families have less money left over after paying the bills. Black persons also receive fewer employer-provided benefits than white workers. In 2018, 75% of white workers were offered health insurance from their employers, compared to only 55% of Black workers. Similarly, Black workers were 14% less likely than white workers to have any type of retirement plan through their employer. Next slide. This is my last slide. I'm sure everyone's breathing a sigh of relief. I know I am. So we've come full circle to the problem we started off with Benisa, and everyone has been emphasizing it. Heidi spoke about it, Patanisha, Michael. We have the same issue, the ever-increasing racial wealth gap. On an average, Black families now own 1/5 of the total wealth by whites. For every dollar a typical white household has, a Black household has 10 cents. Stable full-time employment that provides health benefits is a basic human right for those able to work. From slavery to the present day, Black people have been denied this basic right. This obviously affects health, because most people, the way our system is set up in the United States, how do we get our health insurance? Most people get it through their employers. So now I would like to introduce to you Qiana Washington, who will be discussing health. Thank you, Teresa, so much.
Might want to unmute because that would be a good idea. My presentation is called A Dangerous Prescription, the History of Health and Black People in the United States. First, I want to start with, just a second, because I have, okay, perfect. James Marion Sims, he's widely referred to as the father of modern gynecology. During slavery times, Dr. Sims, from 1845 to 1849, used enslaved women, Black women, to surgically experiment on their vaginas. Specifically after childbirth, there's a condition called vaginal fistulas that would develop. And he was approached by white slave owners and asked to fix the issue. Obviously, it disabled the slave women, so that caused a financial impact. And so what he did was he at first he refused because he said they couldn't really fix the problem. And then he decided that he'd try it out. And so what he did was started experimenting on women. He did it without anesthesia. So these operations would usually last a couple of hours, 1 to 2 hours. And the women, as you would imagine, would be in quite a bit of pain. And so as this seems pretty gruesome, More recently, in 2006, the Journal of Medical Ethics published an article defending Sims as a hero and claiming that he had the women's consent, which was kind of ridiculous because Black people that were enslaved did not have the ability to consent. They could not refuse to do anything legally. They could not refuse to do anything their slave owner wanted them to do. Okay, so this whole experimentation on Black people did not stop there, unfortunately. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment ran from 1932 to 1972. That's 40 years. And to put that in context, there are a number of us who were born in the 70s. And so that's how long it continued to go on. The experiment originally recruited 600 Black men with a promise of free healthcare. As Julie just talked about, healthcare was kind of non-existent for Black people in their jobs. So many people signed up, but the premise of the experiment was that the men were not actually to be given any healthcare. They were given placebos, and the goal of the experiment was to see how the disease syphilis would progress without any treatment. This was despite the fact that syphilis was later treated with antibiotics. And so there became a treatment that was available, but these men were denied that treatment. Local physicians were also convinced not to treat them either. So if they went to someone who was working outside of the experiment, they were told not to treat them. So many of these people died. They went insane. They went blind. They passed their disease on to their children and their spouses. And what you'll see in the picture below at the bottom right-hand corner, this is the gentleman who is on the right, was awarded, given a medal by Bill Clinton for his quote-unquote participation in this study, which is very problematic because one, I mean, what really should be apparent is these people were tortured unnecessarily. And this in the wake of the fact that in 1947, there were national or international rules passed prohibiting experimentation on people after World War II and Hitler. Hitler famously experimented on Jewish people, and so the world decided that that was a bad idea, but the United States continued to do it until 1972. And so rather than admitting the shame of this experiment, this gentleman was given a medal and treated as if he did something great for medical science, and when he was really a victim of our society. So this brings us to, this is Sir Francis Galton, who was also you know, given a title for the type of work that he did. He is Charles Darwin's cousin, and he had his own theories about medicine and you know, health and race and things like that. In 1883, he published a book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development. His theory was that some are considered genetically feeble and thus unfit to breed. He talked about inferior races, which, as you might imagine, included Black people. And based on Francis Galton's statements and theories, there were things that were called forced sterilization. This has kind of modern ramifications in that, you know, if Black women or Black girls come to a doctor and they are pregnant, they are encouraged to seek an abortion, whereas white girls in the same position are encouraged to seek prosecution. both would be underage and victims of assault. However, based on this theory, or it has roots in this theory by Francis Galton, the Black women are encouraged to terminate their pregnancies. Next, we're moving to the pregnancy mothers and the idea of healthcare for women. And so this is a quote from Linda Villarosa, who is a reporter with the New York Times Magazine, or a writer. She says, there is this kind of racism in the healthcare system, and most of it is unconscious. It's a kind of bias that's existed for a long time that we've known about, that is affecting the birth experiences of Black women in America. What's interesting about this, she refers to it as unconscious bias, but there's quite a bit of it that I think is conscious. And, you know, I'll point out the quote from an Ohio State Senator, Dr. Steve Huffman, who recently made, when he referred to Blacks or coloreds. This was during the pandemic recently. He said that more Black people are subject to COVID because of their poor hygiene practices. So I would argue that it's not so much unconscious, though that might be part of it, but some of it might be quite conscious. So pregnancy-related deaths for Black women ages older than 30 is 4 to 5 times the rate of white women. Most pregnancy-related deaths are preventable, and racial and ethnic disparities in pregnancy-related deaths have persisted over time. So this is not something that has really gone away. And this is information that I obtained from the CDC. In a recent publication by CNN, Black newborns are also more likely to die when looked after by white doctors. So it's not just the mothers that are dying in childbirth, but also the newborns that are dying when they are treated by white physicians. Black babies in the United States are more likely to survive childbirth if they are cared for by Black doctors, but 3 times more likely than white babies to die if they are looked after by white doctors, a study found. The mortality rate of Black newborns in a hospital shrunk by 39% and 58% when Black physicians took charge of the newborns after birth. The mortality rate for white babies was largely unaffected by the doctor's race. And this is important because you would imagine that if the issue was that, you know, we're just dealing with incompetence of some sort, that white babies would similarly be subjected to this type of incompetence. But, you know, when both races of doctors, or any race of doctors, takes care of white babies, they end up surviving. When you have Black doctors taking care of Black babies, they end up surviving. And you have white doctors taking care of Black babies, they end up dying. So it's really kind of a life and death problem here. So that brings us to 2020 and the pandemic. As many of you heard and Julianne alluded to, there's been a disproportionate impact of Black people, or on Black people, of the pandemic. And so we talked about Dr. Steve Huffman's thoughts on that and why he thinks that is. But the CDC has its own ideas about that, why that is. And the first on the list is discrimination. Then the second on the list is healthcare access and utilization, occupation, the vast majority of the people that end up having these negative outcomes, death outcomes from COVID, tend to be essential workers who are not able to take time off, cannot work from home, and are much more likely to be exposed to COVID than white workers who might be able to work from home or not work in jobs in which they are being exposed to COVID. As you saw in Julie's presentation, she mentioned that that many Black women are working in healthcare industry or working in retail, in situations where they would be exposed at a higher rate to COVID. And when you combine that to situations where they're getting reduced health care or not being discriminated against in healthcare by doctors, then they're less likely to have a positive outcome. In fact, we have the numbers here for Washington, D.C. Blacks are more than twice as likely as whites to catch COVID. And then here we have the outcomes compared to whites. You have 2.6% higher. This is a national rate, catching the COVID. Hospitalization 4.7% higher, and 2.1 times higher. I mean, I shouldn't say percent, times higher, likely to die.
How do you shelter in place when your home is the sidewalk? Or wash your hands for 20 seconds when there's no soap or running water? Right now, it's even tougher for America's homeless youth. So we're giving another $1 million to help keep them safe. Because we're all in this together, and everyone deserves a fighting chance.
You might recognize that as a Super Bowl ad that was put on by Kia, kind of outlining the challenges of dealing with COVID when you have these disproportionate impact. Also, I would point out, many of you have heard of Senator Tom Cotton. He describes slavery as a necessary evil upon which this union was built. And so I would submit to you that that attitude of, these things being necessary for our country has really exacerbated some of these problems and led to these negative outcomes for Black people in health. So thanks so much for coming to our presentation. The next up is Judge Judy Johnson, and Judge Johnson will be leading our question and answer portion.
So good evening, everyone. We have received a lot of information that I hope provides a historical context for where we are as a country and where the state of the African American community is and how it got there. When we were putting together this presentation, we decided against using prompts to sort of force the conversation in a particular direction, and rather agreed on having a sort of open town hall forum in which people can share their thoughts and comments. And I'd particularly like to know what people found the most interesting, or what what perception or information they found most helpful in understanding where we are today. Anyone have comments?
Got a comment. Good evening, Judge. Michael Whalen here. Can you hear me?
I can.
I think what struck me is that I was present for a 2018, I believe, presentation to criminal defense lawyers in Monterey by Brian Stevenson that ultimately became his documentary True Justice, and of course the movie Just Mercy. So I've seen some of the brutal Black history. He presents that well. Tonight, it's the second time I've heard it presented. And from my point of view, it can't be presented too much. And I just want to thank everyone that presented tonight for the honesty. I've described it as the brutality that's needed to knock us over the head with true Black history. So thank you, Judge. Thank you, everybody.
So one of the challenges here is that this information is not presented in schools, and people are not forced to look at this history and become conversant with it as part of a true fact of American history. We tend to suppress this information and to bury it because it does not comport with the mythology that we've all been indoctrinated on of America, the land and the free, in which everyone is treated equally and have the ability to rise to whatever heights their talents can take them. Anyone else have a comment?
Judge Johnson, this is Pavir Shoker. I had a comment. When we talk about these issues and where we are in this country, we tend to say, okay, what do we do next? How can we fix it? But a presentation like this forces you to say, hang on, before we jump, let's just take a step back and see where it came from, where we all started from. So from that perspective, everybody did an outstanding job. I believe this recording should be sent, to the whole Bar Association, have the kids watch it. I think everybody did an amazing job. And this is a good way to say, before we can run and find the fixes, let's just acknowledge where it all started from. Thank you.
I thought that I have is that most of the time we focus our attention when we're talking about racism on the Karens of the world. Everybody know what the reference the Karens of the world is to? The white women in particular, although I guess there have been some men who have called the police when they found Black people doing ordinary things that were not against the law, like the man in Central Park who asked a woman to leash her dog in an area where dogs were required to be on a leash, and she called the police and said that a Black man was menacing her in the park. What I think this slideshow does is makes very clear that dealing with the Karens is relatively easy. Dealing with an individual who is racist and biased is relatively easy. But the greater challenge faced by African Americans and all people of color in this country is the institutional racism. And I think this program does a good job of showing how deeply embedded these concepts are in every asset. And we've only touched on 5 areas of society and shown the history of racism in those 5. Any more comments?
Well, just for my part, I'll have to say this presentation was a lot more graphic in some of the aspects than I've seen. It just tears my heart to be part of a society that does this kind of thing to other human beings. And I mean, it's the Japanese in World War II, it's the Jews, it's the Blacks. It's just, how can our society purport to be educated, advocating equality for everyone? Excuse me. Oh, and about the women too. Let me comment there too. How can we have a society like this with so many different strata and deny opportunities to so many people. It tears my heart that this is perpetuated even now in the 21st century. I'm just sickened is what I am.
The information presented is pretty sobering and somewhat overwhelming, and we were frankly concerned about that. But it is, as Michael said, the brutal history. And unless we face that history, we could never solve the problems. One of the reasons that we wanted to do this presentation, and I take no credit for the inspiration for it. It actually came from these women who have been women and men who have been presenting here tonight. I came on at the tail end, but the reasons that whites don't know about it is because they have not been affected by it. So most of you probably grew up in the suburbs in the 50s, or actually you're younger than me, so 60s and 70s. And so you were exempt from a lot of the pressures that ordinary blacks faced. And so there was no perceived need for you to get involved with these issues. It's part of what Michael outlined as the problem narrative, that whenever Black people raise an issue, we're the problem. We're causing the fuss, rather than the things that have impacted us and then have been brought down upon us. Any other thoughts that anyone wants to share?
Yeah, Malcolm Sher here. I would just like to say that this has been a fantastic presentation. As many of you know, I was born in what was Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and I lived there till I was 16. And I would have to say that we lived with a great deal of privilege, but as children growing up, we saw what was going on around us, but we weren't taught, whether by family or teachers, how to deal with it, because it was sort of just there. We were privileged. It was we and they, and you know, the history of that country was terribly racist, and my eyes were only opened when I went to live in London in the early 60s, and also realized that Britain itself is a very racist country, although many people tell you that it is not. But of course, Britain owned most of Africa, India, and its empire was vast. And what was practiced was just overt racism. Then I came to live in this country 44 years ago, and I have to tell you that this presentation tonight has really brought home to me the great degree of racism that still exists in this country. And it's clear to me that folks have worked really hard to come up with the statistics, the slides, the presentations tonight. I echo some other comments which were, you know, we can talk about this, we can see it, we can acknowledge it. The question is, what can we do about it in the future? I mean, hopefully a change in the administration might help, probably will help, but we have really got to do some deep thinking and acknowledgement that this racism still exists in this country. And until we acknowledge that, we're not going to be able to fix it or do very much about it. And I'm afeared of that. And I'm hoping that tomorrow night or in the future, we will have some folks talk about what their thoughts are about how we can change our attitudes and how we can help bring the problem to the fore, not amongst only, you know, lawyers like ourselves, because I think we'd all agree that that we agree with what we've heard tonight. How do you bring that into the broader community and take some steps to just to make this better known and better accepted. Thank you. Well done, everybody. I'm amazed. Terrific presentations.
Just as a follow-up comment from me on that, and then I'll yield the ground to any others who want to talk. It's interesting that we have all kinds of names for what we call the racism in our society, but no one ever applies the word apartheid, or very few people apply the word apartheid to racism in the United States. And I frankly cannot see the difference between the racism practice in South Africa and Rhodesia, and in certainly the Deep South.
I think another concept that would apply, and when we talk about changing the paradigm and how we think about things, Americans think in terms of affirmative action. That's the word that's thrown out a lot. It's, do we need it? Do we still need it? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I think that if we think about America from 1865 to 1965, I refer to that as white affirmative action. That is essentially the apartheid equivalent of what we've been doing in this country. And all the presentations today spoke to that. This was a government-sponsored program to enhance a certain part of the American citizenship. And they've had this advantage for, a 100-year span. And it wasn't until 1965 that we started to try to twist that scale and get that scale back on balance. That's a process that continues today. And I think that's a way to diffuse arguments about, oh, why do we still need to do these kinds of things to help others out? We've had 100 years of white affirmative action, and it takes a while to get back to zero, if you will. So this was a tremendous presentation of that, I thought. It's shocking and very emotional about the degree of disparity that we've been enduring. So thank everyone for this presentation today.
So I have a question for everyone, and that is, okay, what are we going to do about it? That it's very easy and inspiring to present the problem, but it's very difficult and confounding to figure out what, number one, what we as individuals can do about it, and number two, what we could do as a legal community can do about it. And I think the takeaway from this should be is what action as an association and as lawyers and as individuals can we take to address the systemic problems that we now all recognize.
I think it starts with discussion. I think as the theme earlier when we started today, the paradigm needs to be defined and revised. Discussion about what is needed. Terms like most qualified. Who is qualified to get a job? Who is most qualified? That term is antiquated. There are many people who are qualified to get any particular job. If you're hiring at McDonald's, and you get 1,000 applications, all 1,000 people are qualified. The decision as to who among that 1,000 will be hired depends on the person doing the hiring. That person decides who is, quote unquote, most qualified. The term such as merit-based decisions, that term is antiquated. Many people merit a decision to be hired into a job. We have to break down those kinds of terms and make people realize that a lot of this is subjective, and that if some people are given a chance to succeed, that they will succeed. And I think those kind of systems have to be attacked and questioned every time it's brought up. Oh, I want the most qualified for the job. Well, let's talk about what you mean by that. And really it's a hypothetical definition. I think it needs to be challenged.
But that's dealing with stuff on a macro level, and we are operating on a micro level. And I think we need to talk about what we can do on that micro level, because the macro level is too big at this particular point.
Oh, David, I like to say that when we did this program, it just was we had a whole series of programs lined up of things that we want to talk about, but we felt like people couldn't understand it unless they understood the history. So we had to play a little catch up. So this presentation wasn't about coming up with solutions. We actually want to do that later on. This was more about just catching, so we're talking the same language, I think was one of the things we said, that right now we have not been talking the same language. You kind of have to have that background to understand what we're going to talk about. So I think we need to dig a little deeper into it. And we're going to have programs discussing alliances and discussing solutions and other things we can do. But this was just a brief, very brief history lesson to kind of to help people understand why so many Black folks are so upset and angry right now.
And it was beautifully done and very important, and deeply appreciated, Michael.
Thank you, David. I want to say I thank you for their call to action. I know we're at time, and I just wanted to say one of my first things was that we first must recognize the disparity. And we're about 46 to 50 people here now recognizing, even as a woman of color, there are things that I learned tonight. I've held back the tears. It's very hard to be a part of a group that's been so disenfranchised, but I'm also so proud to be a part of a group that persevered. But I think the first thing is letting the larger population know what we all learned tonight, and then the things that we still haven't touched on. So I just appreciate all of you guys being here, and thank you.
Yeah, and I would add to that, as we talked about those ground rules at the beginning, sometimes our natural tendency is to want to go straight into action. What are we going to do about it? And so it actually is uncomfortable to sit with and expand our own awareness, and again, bringing other people with us. Why is it that you all are the ones who came tonight? You know, is it because you already had an inkling of this? Is it because you didn't know anything? There are some who didn't come because they're dismissive of the idea that racism even still exists today. And we've all been discussing this with people that we're talking to within the Bar Association and other affiliates that we work with. So I think that conversation around getting a deeper understanding as to what's happening and then working towards how do we actually really approach this. And David, I liked what you said in terms of the different levels. There's that macro level, and then it's also just where we are right now within our own legal community. And that can go a little bit faster. So with that, because we are on time, what I'd like to do is harness some of the thoughts that you're currently experiencing to support the committee on what our next steps are and where do we want to go from here. And as you can see, at the very beginning, part of our objective was to really have you reflect, to think about what you hadn't, you know, what's something that you learned that you didn't know, what was surprising. And so if you could, just for a moment, you know, write in the chat, what's one thing that stands out for you that was new, that was surprising, that was most disturbing, or something really insightful for you based on this discussion, the presentations, our time together. And if you could just respond freestyle in the chat, that'll give us some feedback as to how you're processing this a little bit. And then I'm going to give you just a minute to do that. And then we want to get some more feedback around how we might move forward with the next town hall. So when we came together and we had actually the racial reconciliation forum, and we had talked about how often should we be meeting as a community, and it was pretty much quarterly. So we do want to work with having a next session, And we have identified that next session, which will be on the criminal justice system. And then we also have outlined a lot of other ideas, but we want to get your input on that as well. So as you're writing that in the chat, we have a couple of polls for you. And the first is our objective, and based on the feedback that I've heard, I'm thinking that we might have met that objective or that goal, which is really to pique your interest and to have you leaving here with more questions than answers, and having an interest in the energy to really pursue opportunities that increase your understanding of racial inequity and systemic racism. And so, Teresa, if we could put the poll up on how people are feeling about that. We'd love to hear your input. So how likely are you to pursue more opportunities to increase your understanding of racial inequity and systemic racism, going from very likely, somewhat likely, not very likely, or not sure?
All right, it looks like most people have responded. 31 out of the 36 people have responded. Give you guys maybe a couple more seconds.
And if you're waiting for the poll, you can be writing in the chat the questions, the first question around what was the most insightful, disturbing, surprising, or new.
All right, do you want me to share the results, Benisa?
Yes, thanks, Teresa, yes. Wow. Okay, so we have 91% saying very likely. And again, you know, there's that whole thing of preaching to the choir. So I'm feeling as though some of you are here tonight because you already had some understanding of this. But this is great feedback to the team who, as you have mentioned, put a lot of work into developing the presentations and researching. And we even thought that it would be really fun to record ourselves having our town hall meetings, because in and of itself, when people were bringing new information, we would have discussions about it right then. And we go, we should have been videotaping ourselves all the time. That could have been the town hall meetings. So just engaging with this, it was definitely a work of passion, and one that all of us are committed to, not only because of the experience that we see ourselves going through, or we see others going through, or it's really just having that compassion that I think was mentioned during the discussion around the humanity of it, and how could people treat people in this way, and then what's the cost to this country. And so finally, now my screen is sticking. As I mentioned, the next town hall will be on the criminal justice system, past and present, and it'll explore historical injustice and current racial disparities in law enforcement, judicial proceedings, and corrections. And then the last thing we'd like to do is just another final poll, which looks at what topics would you like to explore in upcoming town hall meetings. I saw a lot of snippets in the chat throughout the presentations where people were bringing up those ideas. We would love to be able to capture those so that our planning team can work with incorporating that, especially ideas that we haven't thought of on, you know, where do we go next? And Teresa, if you can put up the next poll, some of those may be more informative topics that you want to learn more about. Some of them may be around member discussion. So just really true town hall meetings where we have a topic where we engage in a larger conversation with everyone to, again, come, you know, expand our awareness. And then again, how do we start working towards that next step? How are we going to know when we've learned enough and when we can start working towards action? And so again, if these areas are not something that you think are front and center, you can go straight to the other, and please write your topic areas in the chat.
Okay, it looks like we've got 28 of 36 people have voted. $32, $33. Anybody else? All righty.
I'm really appreciating that high response rate.
Yeah.
Wow. So it looks like there's some interest in having a member discussion where it's more of a complete town hall format where we have some things to talk about as a community on influencing a more just and equitable society. And then the next highest of 47%, systemic racism in additional key sectors. So maybe something like what we did tonight, part 2. And if you have some additional sectors, make sure you put those into the chat as well, because this is something that is embedded within all of the sectors in our society. And then implicit bias and allyship. Wonderful. So again, before we close, again, you guys have thanked the panel. I want to thank Heidi, Patanisha, Qiana, Julianne, Michael, and Teresa. It was just a great initiative to work with us, to work with this, and we were just not even initially understanding how much work we were going to be and time we were going to have to put into this, but it definitely seems from your feedback that that effort and that work showed. So great job, team.
And thank you to Judge Johnson too.
And Judge Johnson, thank you. As she mentioned, she was at our DEI committee and it kind of reached out, and she has been a wonderful add to the committee. And so even though she's saying it was everyone else, if you hear Judge Johnson, then you know whatever she says, I'm always hanging on to her word. So thank you so much for that. And then we want to continue with our journey around racial equity, healing, and justice. Thanks for staying a little bit over time.
Thank you,
right.
everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a great night, everyone.